So the physiology of respiration, and remember that respiration is the actual gas exchange, the gas exchange with either the air that we breathe in the blood or the blood and the tissues. There's actually two different levels of respiration that we'll talk about. Before we talk about respiration, we need to talk about and diffusion. If you remember from maybe high school science class, like the picture, you have that drop of food coloring that's high in concentration. So the water has no food coloring in it all the way on the right. I'm sorry, all the way on the left. And you drop that food coloring in, and you can see here in the you got this it's area of high concentration. And basically a lot of biology is diffusion. You have this area of high concentration, and it's going to want to diffuse from high to low concentration. So for example, if we squirt a nasty smelling perfume in the center of the room would be like over here, and we squirt the perfume like in this picture. It's just in the center of the room, and then over time it's going to diffuse out further and further and further till finally it achieves what we call equilibrium, or the smell particles, or in this case the food coloring particles, are equal all over the entire room or the entire container here. So that's the process of diffusion, and the biggest thing again is from high to low concentration. So if we had a oxygen, for example, when we breathe it in, the air that we breathe in is 21% oxygen, and our blood is going to have no or little oxygen. So this is going to be the alveoli, and this will be in the capillary. So we're going to set up a situation where we have lots of oxygen in the alveoli, and it's going to diffuse from a high concentration to a low concentration. So to review some of the anatomy again, remember we get down to the level of the bronchiole, and the air continues into these alveolar sacs, which contain all these alveoli here, and this is the process of gas exchange. You have oxygen diffusing into the bloodstream, and so in this picture over here, you have all these those capillaries surrounding the alveoli. So it's going to diffuse. So you would have a capillary right here. So it's going to diffuse actually into the blood and get picked up by the red blood cell. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But also, not just oxygen, but you also have carbon dioxide. We'll talk about that in a little bit. CO2, carbon dioxide, that's going to diffuse from the blood into that alveoli. And this is respiration, which is this process of gas exchange. You have respiration here because you have gas exchange. You have oxygen going from high concentration to low in the blood, and then you have carbon dioxide going from high concentration in the blood diffusing over into the alveoli where it's low in concentration. If you're having trouble with that, go back to the previous slide and think about oxygen being that drop of food coloring in the water, and it's going to diffuse in this alveoli is packed with oxygen. It's going to diffuse over to the blood that is lacking oxygen. Same thing with the carbon dioxide. You have lots of carbon dioxide in the blood, none in the air that we breathe, or very little in the air that we breathe, and it's going to diffuse again from the blood, where lots of carbon dioxide, to an area, the alveoli, that has little carbon dioxide. And then when we exhale, it's going to actually go out into we're going to breathe that out into the environment. So this is everything I just said, just in a different picture. Again, the oxygen diffuses from the air that we breathe into the blood, and carbon dioxide diffuses from the blood into the alveoli, where it's then transported out of our body via our mouth. And this process is alveolar respiration. Your textbook may call it external respiration, and it doesn't matter, they're both the same. So external respiration and alveolar respiration are really the same thing. Some people, though, have a hard time with external respiration because it's a little confusing when you introduce the next term. But remember, external respiration refers all this air that you just breathed in came from the external of the body, so it came from the outside. So that's why we call it external respiration, or a little bit easier is alveolar respiration. Again, this is just another picture of the same thing. I like this picture because it shows you the blood coming here by the capillary, by the alveoli, and oxygen has to diffuse through the alveolar wall, through the capillary wall, and into the blood, and carbon dioxide has to diffuse from the blood through the alveolar wall, through the capillary wall, then through the alveolar wall. So there is some distance, and the important point here is that let's say the patient has a lot of fluid in their alveoli for whatever. It's a drowning victim, or there's some heart conditions that can cause some fluid build up in the lungs. Either way, so now we have fluid in the lung, in the alveoli. So now that oxygen is going to have to go through the water as well as all the other membranes that it did. Same with the carbon dioxide. It's going to have a harder time getting to this space, or getting to this space depending on what it is. So the idea with diffusion is the more stuff it has to go through, the worse it's going to be, and we're really going to get to that when we start to see fluid build up in the alveoli. So we just picked up a bunch of oxygen in the lungs, and it's transported back to the heart, to the left side of the heart, and that oxygenated blood is then transported out of the aorta and then to all the various parts of the body. Where does it go from there? So it goes to each organ via, of course, the arteries. This is just one example. We have the liver, and you can see over here that that blood comes down the aorta, and then up the hepatic artery, and that feeds the entire liver blood. And of course, every cell in your body needs a constant supply of blood. That's really the end game here. But what happens to that blood at the level of the tissue? So if we zoom into a small area here, we'll get to this picture of capillary. So you see the small little artery here, and then we get to, or this should probably actually be a arterial And then we get to these small, very tiny vessels, these arterioles, and then we're going to get even smaller to these capillaries. And then, of course, we know that it collects in the venules and then veins. But this is where all that, see, it's pictured red here, and that's because we think about that as with oxygen. So all that oxygen is going to do the same thing here. The blood is high in concentration with oxygen, and that's going to diffuse to a low concentration in the tissues. So the blood, where it's high concentration to the tissues. Same thing with carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is a waste product in the tissues, and that's going to diffuse again from a high concentration in the tissues to a low concentration in the blood, and that's going to be transported back to the heart and to the lungs that way. So this is what we're talking about when we're talking about internal respiration. So we have gas exchange again. That oxygenated blood from the lungs goes back to the heart, goes down through the artery systems to the different organs, and then the arteries get smaller, of course, and feed the tissues, which then you have it breaks off finally into capillary beds, and that's where we have gas exchange from the blood to the tissues in the capillaries, and then oxygen again diffuses from the blood to the tissues, bathes the tissues in all that oxygen. They need lots and lots of oxygen, and that's where the blood picks up carbon dioxide because the blood just does not have lots of carbon dioxide in it, so it's going to diffuse over to the blood to be taken back. This is just another picture saying the same thing. I just like this one a little bit more. This would be one capillary right here, and you see the oxygen as well. We haven't really mentioned it, but it's also other nutrients, so like sugars and things like that to help the cells. And you see up here, these are all right here, the tissue cells right here that make up the tissue. So the capillary going through the tissues feeds the cells with oxygen and other nutrients, and then carbon dioxide and other waste is going to diffuse from high concentration to low concentration in the blood and be transported back to the body. And again, that process is what we call cellular respiration. And some textbooks actually call it internal respiration, because this is gas exchange, respiration gas exchange, that takes place in the tissues or an internal gas exchange. So how is the different gases transported in the blood? So we know the process of how they're exchanged, how oxygen gets into the blood at the alveoli, how carbon dioxide gets into the blood at the tissue. So we know that process. Of course, that's diffusion. But how are they transported? And they're actually transported by two different mechanisms. For oxygen, most of the oxygen is transported in on the hemoglobin. So the oxygen has to diffuse from the alveoli through the alveolar membrane, through the capillary membrane, into the blood, and then into a red blood cell, where it sticks basically like a magnet onto the hemoglobin. And in the hemoglobin, or on the hemoglobin, that's where oxygen is carried to the different in the blood, and then once it gets to the tissues that are lacking oxygen, this will pop off and diffuse, of course, out into the tissues. But most of it, 97%, is attached to hemoglobin. Just to get a little bit in detailed from what is hemoglobin and what is a red blood cell, if you just take a drop of blood here and look at it under a microscope, you see all these red blood cells here. They have the basic shape. They're round and they have almost like a filled up donut hole there. And if you look at it from the side, it would look like this, almost like a barbell. And the idea is that just increases the area that oxygen can diffuse into that to the red blood cell. They also bend and twist and things like that to get through those very tiny little capillaries. So if we zoom in on just a little bit better picture here of a red blood cell, you see how they kind of look like that donut or that filled in donut, whatever. But if you do a cross section here, look inside, in here, this is where we're going to end up. We're going to look at all that the inside is just packed with hemoglobin. And so I like this picture because you can see, like, if you were to theoretically pop a red blood cell and have all the hemoglobin just spill out, it would just, it's just almost like a jelly donut. You could just squeeze out all that hemoglobin. It's just packed with hemoglobin. And just as a FYI, you definitely don't need to know this, but one red blood cell contains 250 million hemoglobin molecules. So when we look at this red blood cell, it basically has some support scaffolding to keep its shape, but other than that, it's just packed with red blood cells. I'm sorry, it's just packed with hemoglobin, and hemoglobin is what is carrying the oxygen. We'll have a like that a little bit. This is a hemoglobin. It actually has 4 places for oxygen. So 4 oxygen molecules can be carried by 1 hemoglobin. So they have a little seat, and they fit real nicely in this area right here, and that's how they're transported throughout the body. And when oxygen is connected to the hemoglobin, we call that oxyhemoglobin. When it's deficient in oxygen, it'd be nice if we just called it hemoglobin, but we actually call that deoxyhemoglobin. So 2 different words to know. Oxyhemoglobin is when it has oxygen bound to it, and deoxyhemoglobin is without oxygen. Carbon dioxide is transported a little bit differently. That the carbon dioxide here is diffuses into the bloodstream at the tissues. But by far, about 7% of the carbon dioxide actually just dissolves in the plasma, which the plasma is the liquid part of blood, the watery part of blood. So 7% of carbon dioxide that's transported by the blood is mixed in the blood. So your blood is actually carbonated, like a carbonated soft drink. Very little bit actually does attach to hemoglobin, maybe about 23%. But the vast majority of the vast majority of carbon dioxide actually mixes with water. So not dissolved in water like you're dissolving that food coloring in water, but they actually has a chemical reaction with water to create something new. In this case, it's bicarbonate. So carbon dioxide mixing with water, not just dissolving in water, but actually having a chemical reaction with water, creates this bicarbonate system here. We'll talk a little bit more about the slide. So carbon dioxide plus the water makes, the important thing is not the name, but it's important to know that carbon dioxide plus water makes an acid. So that sets up a pretty good question. So go back and think about that patient that had the rib fractures, and he wasn't breathing very well, and obviously he was not getting enough oxygen. But and that's a huge problem that we're going to have to deal with. But that's not the only problem that we have to deal with. The other issue, remember, he is not ventilating very well. So he's not getting fresh air into his alveoli. He's not getting the oxygen that he needs, but he's also not getting rid of carbon dioxide. So he was breathing really poorly, not just slow, but he was just breathing really shallow. So his alveolar ventilation was really low. That's supposed to be a V. Alveolar ventilation was low. So he was not getting rid of carbon dioxide. As a result, in his blood, his CO2 level is going higher and higher and higher and higher. In fact, if you looked at his graph of his CO2 level, over time, it's going to go higher and higher and higher. So this would be CO2 level, and this is time. Over time, his blood CO2 level is going to go up, 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 because he is not ventilating effectively. He's not getting rid of that carbon dioxide, so it's staying in his body. So his carbon dioxide is going to go up. And if we told you that carbon dioxide mixes with water and creates an acid, what's that going to do to his blood? So blood's supposed to be right here at 7.35. You don't have to know this, but let's roughly 7.35. If he is retaining carbon dioxide because he's not ventilating very well, he's actually going to push his blood pH, or the acidity of his blood. He's going to make it more acidic, which, not to confuse you, is actually a lower pH. But he's going to push it to the acid side. Versus someone, let's say we have someone who's having like a panic attack or something like that, and they are breathing really, really, really fast. They're blowing off too much carbon dioxide, and as a result, we're going to go up the scale. We're going to decrease the acidity of the blood. In fact, we're going to make it more basic, which is the opposite of acidic. So that's not without consequence. The patient has vasoconstriction as a result of that. And if you've ever had a panic attack, for example, if you ever had a panic attack and you're hyperventilating, you might feel funny, you might feel dizzy, you might feel tingly skin, things like that. And that's because the drop in CO2 actually causes vasoconstriction to your brain, so you feel dizzy, and it makes you vasoconstrict to your face, for example, so you feel a little tingly, funny like that, which typically makes the patient feel even worse, so they have a hard time. So this is important to know. Think about, as we move on to the brain's control over ventilation, the brain is actually going to sense a increase in CO2, and that's what triggers a breath. That's what triggers the brain to take a breath.